There were times when the album was being recorded that we didn't know if it was ever going to get made. That's what's special about Ultra. It was the album that almost didn't get finished.
I'm still having letters that receive hundreds of letters received by fans which were so worried about the band was just finished, split it up, because they were all aware about the fact that the problems after the Devotional was just enormous.
Alan left, and Dave went through a horrible time of his life. And I think in the perception of the people, nobody quite expected the band to be coming back.
Well, I think there were so many questions, other questions that arose around that period. I mean, I think when Dave was at this low point around that time, and I think it was much more about, are we going to actually make another record? And if so, how do we go about it,
Well, I gave myself some breathing space after the end of the tour to make sure that I wasn't too frazzled and I was thinking clearly. And I just said to myself, look, if I still feel the same way I do now or did when we were making that last record, if I still feel that way in 6 months' time, then I'll know that I should really just call it quits there. And I did, and that's how I felt, I just still decided that our personal communication hadn't really improved, and that if we went back in the studio together as we were then again, we'd have exactly the same problems again.
As far as I remember, he just said, I can't work in the same way as we worked before, it's just too difficult. And he loved being in the studio much more than the other members of the band, and he was there to the bitter end with Flood every day,
And I didn't want to go through that again, so I thought, right, okay, now's the time. I also thought, we'd achieved a lot, and there were plenty of other things I wanted to do. I wanted to start a family and just sort of have a change, really. I just got a bit fed up with everything.
Yes, I was surprised at Alan's decision of just leaving. Certainly there were, and perhaps as the Devotional tour went on, some of those tensions did start to interact, but I think that Alan's extreme measures of saying, hey, I can't put up with this, I'm going to leave, just Alan in quite extreme, really. I think I was shocked because Alan was not an extreme person, I didn't find.
I think they must have known something like this would happen. I mean, there would be a break of some kind, whether it be me leaving or whatever it would be. I don't know, Martin didn't say very much. Fletch seemed a bit put out. And Dave wasn't around when I tried to tell him. I couldn't get hold of him, I don't know where he was.
Well, it's about time. It's beginning to time you made up your mind. Just what is it all
Finally, I found a fax in my fax machine in Los Angeles that he had sent me saying that he'd left the band. And he did get hold of me on the phone, and I was like, I didn't give it much time, to be honest. I was like, whatever, man, I'm dying here, I was definitely self-absorbed in my drug-fueled lifestyle at that time.
I think that they were quite surprised. He had a meeting at the old office in King's Cross with Fletch and Mike.
And we sort of went, well, you don't have to make the decision now. We're not even going in the studio for it. It was actually less than 6 months, I think, when we had the meeting. And we were just saying, well, we're not even thinking of doing anything yet, I mean, why don't you make the decision at the time? You just had this long tour.
When is a good time to go? I mean, as I said, if I'd have gone in the middle of the tour or something, that would have been much more catastrophic in a way. I didn't want to leave anyone in a difficult situation, particularly.
I was given a very brief statement by him to release, which I did.
hear a voice in the echoing
I spoke to Martin and Fletch subsequently, and they didn't really seem to know why. I mean, nobody really had a good idea other than to say that Alan felt underappreciated.
I guess if the other guys had had a big feeling about it, they would have argued against it.
I hadn't been getting on with him. And I had been saying that I wasn't going to do another album with him.
Here I stand, the accused.
There's still some sense in which he was somehow the outsider, because it's a real hardcore Basildon vibe, wasn't it, from the other three?
We were still wary of Alan, and I think, you know, Martin Fletch more so than me, just because I think they were worried about his musicianship and that he was really good, and maybe he overshadowed in some ways what they did or something. I don't know what that was about, but Alan always had an uphill battle.
I think in his mind, if he was going to continue, he wanted the next records to be done, the next album to be done in a particular kind of way, which I don't think the rest of the band would have found acceptable. And I think it was a bit like, I don't think they had much of a discussion about it. I think he just realised that it wasn't going to happen that way that he wanted it to happen, and so he decided to leave. You should ask him.
Alan, I think, probably had thought that there was no way that we were going to make another record anyway. So he kind of jumped ship before it was all over. And
I didn't necessarily think that the band would split up, no. I mean, it has been levelled that I thought I could split them up, and that's ridiculous, you know. I mean, I knew there were problems, and there were problems that I didn't want to deal with anymore. It was as simple as that, you know, for me. I just decided I didn't want to deal with those problems anymore, and that it wasn't really much fun, you know, being in the studio together. And, you know, it was a good time for me to go and do something else.
In retrospect, I didn't shout out, you know, for him either. I didn't sort of, you know, turn around to the other guys and, you know, try and stop him from leaving.
We always realised how, you know, important he was to us. But, you know, maybe we weren't very good at showing our emotions.
I think Martin's finally melting a little bit with that. But it was always there with Alan, that he was trying to take over. I think I heard that a lot. It was never the case, really. He was just trying to get his ideas across. And I think he had a hard time with that in terms of the walls he tried to break through.
But to his credit, I think, is that even if you make a decision like at the end of the tour, it's such a major decision that it is a really good idea to go away. Because at the end of a tour, you think you're sick of
Everybody
everything
wants
and
to
everyone.
leave, you know.
And to make a sort of knee-jerk decision then would have been, you might have always questioned it later whether you were in the right frame of mind. So he waited to the following April, didn't he? And he was absolutely certain.
Mm-hmm. He made a decision, and whether he regrets that decision now, I don't know.
Yeah, after he told us, I remember getting on a train and going home and thinking, oh well, that's the end of the band.
It was kept pretty quiet until the press release had announced it, and then the phone started ringing.
There were so many calls put into Intercourt that we had to actually put additional phone lines in, and having sort of this emergency helpline installed.
For the fans?
For the fans, yeah, because they were keeping us from doing our usual business because there was not enough phone lines.
I think there was a lot of disappointment, and there was definitely a sense of, well, what are we going to do now? I mean, everybody did appreciate Alan, and everybody did know what he did, and it would go on to affect the way they would work in the studio in the future.
We took another turn and, you know, had to sort of find ourselves again. It was almost like making a broken frame again. We were like a three-legged horse, you know.
I think Daniel really may have been the first person to suggest that we could try and work in a different way and work with different people and still carry on.
If they could survive Vince leaving, they could survive Alan leaving. Although, I mean, that's not to diminish his contribution at all, but, when Vince left, that was like the leader of the band, and the songwriter left, in one go. And Alan was a hugely important part of it, but it wasn't the songwriter and he wasn't really the leader either. And we made a decision which was not to approach it as an album. Initially it was like to approach it as let's go and record some tracks, maybe an EP or something. Take the pressure off it being an album and let's just see how it goes.
And we really needed outside help, to create some atmospheres, much of which Alan would have been doing with Flood or whoever it was he was singing with.
Well, the fact that they got Tim Simmons in, I think that probably helped because he was a mute guy that had actually started, come from nowhere, and they had been introduced to him, and he was like, the young kid around the block that was sort of sniffing around them all the time, and then suddenly he became this producer. So it wasn't so much of having an outsider in, it was having more of somebody from within the family.
Yeah, they don't really interview great deals of people, do they? They're quite good at making decisions.
If you start making the tea, there's a chance you'll be in the band.
We had a meeting, and one of our usual producer meetings, which is like 5 minutes, have a listen to a couple of songs. Yeah, he seems like a nice bloke, might as well get him to do it, kind of thing.
I think Tim was the perfect guy to step in because he really understood what they did. Tim was a fan of Depeche Mode, and I think they needed that. I think they needed somebody who really liked them, not someone who was going to say, right, guys, this is the way you should be doing it, but rather a guy who was going to say, what you've done is great, let me help you do what it is you're trying to do.
He was very much a classic producer in the sense that he was outside the immediate hands-on stuff, because he had a team of people doing that for him.
Q, who was the engineer, Kerry Hopgood, who was the programmer, who's still working with the band today, actually, on their live show, and Dave Clayton, who was a keyboard player and very kind of musical.
I mean, from what I remember from that whole session was, I think, the uncertainty of the actual making of the whole album, because Alan had just left the band, and I think Dave's health was sort of questionable as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was much more about Dave's situation at that time that made me feel concerned about the future of the band, not so much Alan leaving.
I remember just going to visit and saying hi, and Dave being very spaced out, but still very passionate, but very spaced out. I remember having a really good chat with Dave, but worrying about him as well. And I knew a lot of shit was going on.
I've never, I just don't know that much about heroin. So, I just never knew when he was on it, when he was off it, when he was trying to be off it. So, as far as I was aware, he was, off it.
What's frustrating with Dave sometimes, he didn't find it easy to talk to us about it, so it was all cloak and dagger stuff, which made it harder.
I was always naive, and so, I believed that he was, trying to get off the stuff and possibly off the stuff, and was just sick because he was off it.
You can get involved up to a point, but in the end it's somebody's own personal decision in those kind of situations to get themselves better. And you can do absolutely everything you want to do, you can do, but in the end they have to make that decision.
Even actually starting the session, I remember sort of Daniel saying, well, why don't we just get together? Martin's written a few songs, and let's just see what happens, And it's kind of like that for 6 months, really,
I think every one of us had problems, probably still part of the fallout of the Songs of Faith and Devotion tour. Dave had his problems, and I had problems. I was drinking from the moment we got in the studio to the moment we left.
Individuals were in a pickle, and Fletch was probably the straightest one of the lot. He was holding it together quite a lot of the time.
I do remember some of those sessions being extremely trying and difficult. I mean, remember all of them coming out and talking to me and saying, hey, what's going on? How are we going to do it? I remember many a walk around New York City, for example, with Tim, going, how are we going to do this, Jonathan? What's going on? How should we deal, etc.
And the record really did take forever. I mean, the sessions for some of those songs went on for quite a long time.
We wouldn't normally take that amount of time over the record, but there were problems. There were big problems regarding Dave. So we had no choice. I mean, when you do a 6-week session in New York that doesn't bear any fruit, you know, obviously you've got to get that time back somehow.
My fear... I shouldn't really use that word. No, fuck it. It was a fear because I wanted to make I wanted to be involved. I wanted to be involved in the making of a Depeche Mode album. And I thought we were going to be making, sometimes, a Martin Gore solo album because I didn't know whether we were going to have a singer.
The worst time was in New York when, you know, as far as we were aware, Dave was giving up heroin. But at the same time, I don't think he was. I think he was, you know, still on it, and you know, he was unable to sing. And you know, that was when I thought that the band maybe would have to finish because you know, Dave couldn't sing anymore.
He was very unsure about his role in the band. You know, it was just like, I'm this singer and I'm fucked up. And like, and that was the hardest thing for me because I was constantly saying to him, look, we're making this album and they're Martin Gore tracks, and then when you sing on them, they're Depeche Mode tracks. And until you sing on them, it's almost pointless.
I think he just lost all his confidence, and mentally and physically he was like, you know, just so weak that he couldn't. It was like he almost couldn't get a sound out.
Sister, for example, that took almost a week to do the vocal on that, purely because Dave was just not well. And it was hard to get a consistent performance. When it came to comping vocals, we were having almost to do syllable by syllable at times. But in retrospect, I think you've got almost one of the most beautiful vocals.
Sister of night, when the hunger descends and your body's a fire, an inferno that never ends.
I go, goosey now, just thinking about it, what Dave went through to get that track done.
Burns in desire's name.
I don't know where Dave was that he was making that album at times. The unfortunate thing was he was going to NA meetings with the best intentions and then being hit on by dealers on his way out, and then came back to the studio in a not particularly good state.
Breaking down your will to move in for the kill.
Martin rang me up, said, should I just finish the record as a solo record and let's just knock it on the head because it's just too ridiculous. And once again, I was selfishly probably like, do whatever you fucking want. I'm in big trouble here.
I feel it too.
I had 1 foot in and 1 foot out. And that was not 1 foot in and 1 foot out of Depeche Mode. That was 1 foot in and 1 foot out of life. Like, it was like I wasn't sure where I was going.
At the end of the 6 weeks of trying to do vocals in New York, we just said to him, we think you should just, go back to LA and go and see a singing teacher and, try and get your voice back and, just try and get healthy.
We took a break and we came back and we did some more recording, and so generally things sort of seemed to be going okay, and then we went over to LA to record Dave.
That's when he had his big overdose, where he died. And then after that, he got charged. So he got threatened with being thrown out of the States, so he had to go through this course. And then since then, that time, he's been, back, basically.
I put down the drugs and the booze, but I'm still really struggling to find my way, and that takes a long time.
Well, I think Dave started to face up, very much to his own demons and dealt with his issues and started to address them and has worked on them continually since.
I'm a cliche now, because I got clean, but I feel like I'm one of the lucky ones. I managed to get out and get some help. And I'd rather be a cliche that's alive and talking to you today than a dead one that everybody else is talking about afterwards.
It was kind of a resurrection. He went from like the low of that session in New York. We had to really say to Dave, this ain't going to be done, it's not going to be finished, And all of a sudden he sort of resurrected himself a few months later and did a really good job.
I mean, to be honest, I have no idea how he pulled himself together that quickly, and we started recording again, because at that point, not all the vocals were finished. So in a way, I was kind of just amazed that he somehow got it together to come back in and sing.
Here is a page from the empty stage, a cage of the heaviest cross ever made, a cage of the deadliest trap ever laid. And I thank you for bringing me here, for showing me home, for singing these tears. Finally I found that I belong here.
Martin denies ever writing songs about Dave. We're all convinced, certainly, looking at the lyrics, that Martin was. So, whether it was something that was sort of slightly less affected Dave, for example, with Home, that if it wasn't necessarily about him, if it was just about another subject that didn't, touch him, he wasn't going to fight for it.
Bringing me here, for showing me home, for singing these tears. Finally I found that I belong. Feels like home. I should have known from my first breath.
There was a conscious decision to sort of go more towards a Violator approach and just be more electronic than out-and-out rock. Daniel gave us a great quote at the beginning. He said, lads, put everything through a valve. So we went and bought a valve and then decided that he had a point. Again, the irony being that it was hard disk edited and recorded, mainly electronically, but it was almost like recording the Beatles because we were putting everything religiously, Daniel, through a preamp. So it was like we recorded the whole session on a big old Valve desk. So it meant that we'd got, there were artifacts, there was a quality to it, and whether it's just one of those little detail things that you think's there because you've done it, but people did comment that there was a certain sonic and a certain fatness to the album that maybe wasn't on Songs of Faith and Devotion.
Martin initially on Useless had a drum loop which was quite dominated by the ride cymbal. So I suppose it sort of made sense to get a drummer in to maybe sort of play on top of that.
Well, it's about time.
It was always a case of bringing musicians in to sort of make the audio. Instead of taking things off records that you did because you just had a record deck and a sampler, when we were able to have musicians about, it was more interesting to actually have musicians to sample.
And they seemed up for the idea of bringing in different people, because I suppose it was a new experience for them also.
It wasn't like anyone ever performed from the beginning of the track and the end of the track and that was it. It was always going to be highly edited and looked at and massaged until we either got bored or, someone said, you've got to finish that record.
It was a very simple part, but when we got Doug Wimbish into the studio, he said to me, you could do this, but, he could do it with a bit more feel, probably. So, I think it was good to use him.
There was space for people like that to become involved in the group once Alan had left. I think we just picked on people who we really wanted to work with, Jackie Libsite is a huge hero, certainly of mine, and the band are huge Can fans, and same with Tackhead. So it was like, let's get them along for a track and see how it works.
Yeah, it was good to use Jackie, even though what he actually did on the record was very simple as well. He liked to play every drum on its own. It wasn't like he was playing a kit. He liked to play like a snare, and then on another track he'd play a bass drum. It was a very odd way of working, but apparently that's the way he likes to work.
And that was a good session. He guessed it on the bottom line.
Like a pawn on the eternal board.
We got BJ Cole in as well, just because we felt it was like a country-tinged song. So it felt like it needed some pedal steel.
I really enjoyed the bottom line. I think that's a fantastic track, And I enjoyed that because that came about really quite easily, And I think for that reason I really liked it. We didn't really have to sort of overwork that track. And that's a really good sign, I think.
The river flows, the wise man knows I have followed you. I'm yearning, I'm burning, I feel love's wheels turning.
It took 13 months to make the album, which is the longest time I've spent on making any album, really. Normally the albums that I've worked on previously have normally been sort of done in like 3 months,
You have to bear in mind it wasn't like a solid 15 months. It was, there were sessions and then a break, and then we sort of almost did it in like 4 sessions.
I don't know if there can be advantages to taking 13 months to record an album. But I suppose that the only one I can think of is that it gave me lots of breathing space to write songs between recording.
Because it took so long, I think the idea of being able to spend that amount of time on something is vital. I really realised how lucky we were actually for it to have taken that long.
was almost a little bit of a hysteria when we announced that they would be doing promotion and there would be a new album coming out. And it was a mixture of disbelief and sort of hysteric excitement.
Because everybody was just waiting, for the miracle, and the miracle happened.
Crafting what would be a meaningful and useful publicity campaign for that album was a real challenge.
The drug story came into play, obviously, and I think Dave was actually willing to talk about it quite a lot.
Dave had been candid, but he hadn't really discussed the nature of his problems fully, so that had to be dealt with. I mean, that would be the elephant in the room.
It was obviously a concern putting Dave in this arena with the Shocks as such. Everybody wanted to talk about his life and his story.
I think Dave was one of the first, let's say, new wave guys to come down with, the classic rock heroin addiction. I mean, that was really the way the media saw it. You wouldn't expect, fresh-faced, twirling Dave Gahan to come down with a heroin addiction that severe.
I'm never surprised when these things happen, and people are very puritanical about it and will say, how did he ever, oh God. But the thing is, if those things are there and you're a rock star and your life is unreal, and it's been unreal since, 20, 25 years, then, there are no rules. People do bizarre things. In the early days, it was about music and people were excited, or maybe that's just me being naive. But now you're in a market where things like Heat and Now and OK are huge, and people spend millions of pounds getting a great scoop. So stories like that are just tailor-made.
And unfortunately, at the time, Dave was in this sort of confessional stage, so he to a certain extent used to encourage these journalists.
It was like he was using the interviews as therapy sessions or something, and he could talk about it for hours. Sometimes it's difficult to blame the journalists because Dave did like to talk about it so much.
The journalist would have to bring 3 cassettes and he was just like splurting it out. It's really odd because I was sort of depressed, but depression is not seen as rock and roll, but drug addiction is seen as a real rock and roll thing.
Barrel of a Gun, for me, was Dave's story of his then well-published overdoses and the whole drug period. We filmed bits in England in a studio, rockstar lifestyle, in his bath, and then crawling down the stairs, which is a very druggy thing. Sitting at a table, Martin and Fletch being asleep. It was also pointing at myself, but we all were, I think, asleep really while all this happened with Dave. Nobody really interfered much. So that was that point I made a few times in the video where you see Martin and Fletch lying on Dave's shoulder. But I want a very gritty kind of feel, so I use very gritty, very grainy film to shoot them. That's the image of Dave's hair going all places, and then you go into Dave's mind, basically, or his trip, and that's all in black and white. Morocco is straight from the 60s. It's always this sort of hippie drug vibe, so it seemed like a good location in that sense.
A vicious appetite visits me tonight. I won't be satisfied, won't be denied.
And I filmed it all with a round tube around the camera with as much reflective material as I could. So you can see it in the video, in the edges, you see slight reflection. of things, and depending if it was on a longer lens or a shorter lens, it moved a little bit. Dave's eyes were painted shut, which is a great visual effect, you know. But it meant that Dave had to walk with his eyes closed, and therefore, because of all the little streets in Marrakesh, you got this effect of not knowing your way around. And I felt it was somebody who was just finding his way through life like this, not knowing the boundaries.
I think a lot of people were just relieved that they'd finished and done an album, so they needed to clatter back in with a statement. I just always remember the first time you saw Personal Jesus and you saw the video and you went, geez, you know, they're back.
They were still in quite a fragile state, so the thought of touring was pretty much out of the question. I don't think they could have handled a tour on the back of Ultra.
We were terrified of touring, and it was something that we agreed not to do.
I think that the touring environment just wasn't right for any one of us at that point.
First of all, Dave's kind of physical condition didn't allow for it, and I think generally the band's physical and mental state meant they should sort of leave off it for a while, you know, keep away from it.
But it was a big deal for them not to tour on the back of an album.
Yeah, maybe not touring Ultra did do some harm.
Well, the disadvantages were I, didn't make any money. From that entire project, it was like, I remember getting a royalty check like months later after the record was out, and it was, like 50 quid or something, and I was like, what? We spent money on videos and making the record. It was a lot of money, and probably the most expensive record we've ever made, and we didn't tour.
We looked at that very carefully and thought, what could we do instead? And we planned out some launch parties where they would perform.
We did 2 small gigs of about 5 songs each, one in London, one in Los Angeles, where we brought into the London one, we brought the kind of European media, and then all the American media and world's media went to the one in America, and that was great. And Dave was fantastic in it, and he was just kind of coming out of his bad phase.
I'll be fine. I'll be waiting patiently until you see the signs and come running to my open arms.
It was great to see him up on stage. I mean, because most people thought they would never get up on stage again, and he looked good and he was confident and nervous, but he performed those 5 songs really well, and that was very moving actually to see him back up on stage, almost unbelievable for a lot of people.
You can't turn back the time. Don't say you want me. Don't say you need me. Don't say you love me. It's understood. Don't say you're happy out there without me. I know you can't be. 'Cause it's no good. Thank you.
That event that we did at the Shrine was very successful media-wise, and it charted very well. In fact, I think it was the 2nd highest charting record they ever had. So there was no sense that Ultra at the time was an unsuccessful project. In fact, it did exactly what it was meant to do. It put Depeche Mode on track for whatever their next project was going to be.
Ultra was received really well in Germany. I think it was a mixture of people being full of respect for the band, getting back there, and then getting back with such a bold album.
The first 3 singles, Barrel of a Gun, It's No Good, and Home, straight to the #1 in the Italian sales chart.
I think it was fantastic to get that. As I said before, I don't think it necessarily makes it all worthwhile, but I think it gives you a real boost of confidence that the fans are still out there and they still believe in the band and they're still interested. It did get more press than almost any record that they've done, but for all the wrong reasons, And in that sense, I think it was overlooked.
When Ultra was planned, The band felt bad about there not being a tour on the back of it. That was very much in their mind, but they knew they couldn't do it at the time. So planning a singles package right after Ultra allowed them to do a tour and not have to do an album at the same time.
We just had so many singles that had been released, since the release of the first singles album, and it just seemed like the right time to do it. The first one came out after it was 81 to 85. The second one's 86 to 98. It's just like that's a long period.
Well, it was fantastic because it was the first proper tour since Dave got better and everybody was back on track. Obviously, because it's the best of tour, you're not focusing it on any one particular album, and I think that makes it different and exciting.
And I like that tour especially because it was a very simple production tour. Especially after Devotional, where it was this huge, massive set. It sort of really brought it back, and it was just about the songs and the music.
Our audiences are always good, but I think because we were basically playing all the singles, it was just like a big celebration.
I've got to get to you fast before they do. It's just a question of time.
96, when Dave Clayton worked on Ultra, I used to live in his basement, and he came back from the studio and said Depeche Mode were looking for a drummer because they would like to get a drummer involved. And I said, all right, sounds really good, and we met up and played and really got on well with Dave because we just played the first 2 songs or something in the rehearsal room, and he just turned around to me, gave me a hug and said, it took me 15 years to get a drummer. Welcome, it was really, really nice.
Well, you look good. I'll take you under my wing. Somebody's shoe.
I wasn't aware of the depth of the catalogue, I have to say. I knew all the singles, everyone does, but and I'd had Violator, in my collection, and I used to put it on, but yeah, I mean, it was quite a surprise to me when we first started doing gigs and seeing the sort of reaction and the devotion of the fans and everything.
Hey, what? Reach out and touch play.
I guess they were just doing 3 months because they weren't quite sure about how things were going to go. Completely new setup, Alan not there, live drums, Dave just getting clean and all of that, the whole situation. But, we just fell into it really, and before we knew it, we would, been like we've been doing it forever.
Reach out and touch fame. Thanks very much. Good night.
The Ultra album was about recovery in a way. I mean, the years spent on the road, every difficulty, I think nobody had quite gotten over yet.
Much as the earlier albums were reflecting what they were going through, it's the same thing with Ultra. Probably because of what happened, it was a good album, that they all pushed together in a different way.
Again, we proved we could do it, without Alan, Well, I mean, we always knew we could, but to actually prove it,
Obviously, it's a big unknown, if you start working in a very different way without one of your key elements. So I think that we were all, just really pleased that we'd still managed to achieve so much.
At some point, as there always is, there will be some kind of massive critical reevaluation of it, and in the case of Ultra, there should be.
right next to me. You can run, but you cannot hide. Don't say you want me. Don't say you need me. Don't say you love me. It's understood.